Hello, everybody. This is Dennis Wise, and thank you once again for tuning in. So, we're talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and I'll be giving you just a little bit of a context on just how huge this franchise was back in its day. Most of you probably already know the 1939 MGM film, but even before that, Oz was big business. Some background, the first Oz book came out in 1900 when Baum, he was 44 years old. Basically, he's the poster child for finding your life's calling really late in life. And prior to The Wizard of Oz, he had all sorts of odd jobs. It did take him some time, though, to realize that Oz was his thing. So it wasn't until 1904, 4 years later, that he published his first sequel, which was The Marvelous Land of Oz. Yet from 1907 to 1920, Baum published one Oz book a year per year for an additional 12 volumes. And by the time he died in 1919, he had 14 books total, and his Oz books were so popular that people continued the series. We had writers like Ruth Plumley Thompson and John Neal, a few others. They continued writing Oz books well into the 50s. And eventually, the whole series had about 40 titles, a little bit over 40 titles. And so, imagine this. Pretend you're growing up in the United States sometime during the first half of the century. You're a fan of Oz. So, every year at Christmas, a new Oz book comes out, and you get that new book for Christmas every year while growing up. Now, I have a friend. She was 11 years old when the first Harry Potter book came out. He basically grew up with that whole series, always the same age as Harry as he matured. And so you can probably imagine my friend was pretty deeply and emotionally attached to those Harry Potter books. But that was only like one kid over the course of one decade. Imagine something like that happening for 6 decades. And you'll get a pretty good sense of just how many people were affected by Oz. At least 3 generations of American kids, your grandparents and great-grandparents, they grew up with Oz, just like some of us grew up with Harry Potter. But Oz was more than just books. In fact, it's what we might consider today the first true transmedia story world, a fictional universe that audiences can experience in multiple media formats. Today, you know the concept already. You're pretty familiar with it, thanks to things like Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and so on. These franchises have books, movies, video games, fan conventions, all that kind of stuff. Well, the same thing was the case with Oz, except that Oz was one of the first, and mass media technology was still in its infancy. But you had books, you had stage musicals, radio adaptations, you had coloring books, a pretty popular board game, even a number of black and white silent films way before MGM ever produced its iconic Judy Garland film. Because one of the things that Baum did when Oz started getting big, he moved his family to California for a few years. And there in California, he developed his own production company. And so there actually exist 6 black and white silent films featuring Oz. Also, starting with the 8th Oz book, TikTok of Oz, Baum became one of the first fantasy writers to include a map. It might not seem like much, but if you ever read fantasy fiction, almost all fantasy writers, but most famously J.R.R. Tolkien, they always include maps in their fantasy books. And again, Baum was ahead of the curve on this one. And then you get that 1939 MGM film, and that today is what everybody remembers. There's so many iconic phrases, images, songs from that movie, you just have to see it. Wizard of Oz, though, is basically a children's fantasy version of Cthulhu. It's everywhere in American pop culture, and this film greatly extended the life of Oz's story world. And we have television to thank for that, ironically. The first time the movie was ever shown on TV, that was 1956, about 17 years after the movie came out. Because what the cable network CBS, what they did, they bought the television rights, the exclusive TV rights to the film. So they aired it on their network, CBS, and this first airing couldn't have come at a better time. Although the first TV had been invented in 1935, it's a relatively recent invention. Television really only became a big part of American life in the 1950s. Some of you, maybe, you've seen the movie Back to the Future. And that movie has this scene where Marty McFly time travels back 30 years into the year 1955, and he tells a family who had just gotten their first TV set that his own family had two of them. And they think he has to be crazy rich to have two television sets. But anyway, in 1956, like I said, CBS shows The Wizard of Oz on TV for the first time. And it was a major success, and they kept showing the film once per year, every year, until around the 1980s, when the invention of VCRs kind of made the spectacle of movies on TV less special. But just like how earlier generations of Americans grew up with the Oz books, my parents' generation, they grew up with the movie. My mom, for example, she would always know how many times she had seen the movie because of her age. If she was 30 years old, that means she'd seen the movie 30 times. But for our course, we can ask legitimately, I think, why are we doing Oz? What is a children's book doing in a class about monsters? Well, you asked that. One of the major literary impacts Baum had was on fairy tales. The sort of segue in here. Think about every fairy tale you've ever heard. I bet you even money, you're probably going to be thinking of one of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Things like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, or Rumpelstiltskin. You know what these kind of fairy tales look like. You have kings and queens, you have princesses, princes, wicked stepmothers, evil witches, troublesome little fairy creatures, bad magic. And throughout the 19th century, American authors who wrote for children, they basically copied European models of fairy tales for their books. And so their fairy tales by these American authors, they had all these European elements. Baum, though, he wanted to write a specifically American fairy tale, something specific to the United States time and culture. So he creates some good witches to go along with the evil witches. He creates a character after something that American farmers in the Midwest had invented, scarecrows. Not really a European thing. And then you have the Wizard of Oz himself. As you probably know, he's not a wizard. He's a humbug, a con artist. And Baum based him off the guy best known for starting Barnum and Bailey's Circus, P.T. Barnum, who was famously good at self-promotion and advertising, both very American things. And then you get Dorothy herself, this little farm girl from Kansas, the middle of nowhere. She's strong-willed, she's self-reliant, and she's very independent. That's another American thing about Baum's fairy tale. Think about the women you see in European stories like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty. Neither of those women do anything in those stories. Their entire job, basically, is to sit there, look cute, and wait along for Prince Charming to come by to save the day. But that's not Dorothy. She goes on adventures. She solves problems with the help of her friends, and although she does eventually become a princess in some of the later books, she's remarkably egalitarian. In Oz, there's none of that old feudal social stratification that separates the aristocracy from the commoners. Everyone's pretty much on the same rung of the social ladder in Oz, and Dorothy never puts on airs. She's perfectly ordinary, except that she's also very much a feminist, and that's no accident. You see, most of Dorothy's feminism comes about because she's self-reliant and she's too independent, really, to ever need a Prince Charming. So there's that element to it. You got to remember that I mentioned earlier that Baum didn't find his life's calling until relatively late in life, his mid-40s. Well, one of the things that he did in his younger days, he ran this newspaper called the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, back when his family lived in South Dakota. This was a very political newspaper, and remember, at this time, women did not yet have the right to vote. Baum, though, he was a major supporter of women's suffrage, and his mother-in-law actually was Matilda Gage, who was a huge name in first-wave feminism. Unfortunately, as passionately as Baum lobbied for an amendment to the South Dakota state constitution granting women the right to vote, that amendment did not pass at that time. And after that, he didn't stay long in the newspaper business. After that, he ended up moving to Chicago, where he would eventually write his first Oz book. But this feminist street cred probably explains why Dorothy is such an independent little girl. Overall, though, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, it was pretty big business, and it still is, in fact. And as you're going to discover real soon, it has a ton of monsters in it, although they might not seem like monsters at first glance. You have the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion. They're all monsters in their way, but they're good monsters. Just like you get good witches to balance out the bad witches in the book. What's going to make this book so interesting, though, for us, is why, when monsters are so often a source of horror in other texts, the characters in Baum's book manage to live with their monstrosity in a peaceful and dignified manner. And we'll see exactly how they do that as we go through the course. Hopefully, you're looking forward to it. I know I am. Thank you, and we'll see how it goes.